We're continuing our journey in the sanctuary today. And you remember last time we discovered the altar of incense, and it was the highest throne room in the sanctuary, right? We also discovered that it had horns on it, which represents the government of God. And so we begin to recognize that our prayers rest upon the government of God, because God's government is about bringing people near to Him. Isn't that great news? And so today we want to look at the significance now of that incense that we were smelling that drew us to the camp of Israel. The significance of incense is the title of the message today. And as I was putting this together, I brought together some quotes from the Spirit of Prophecy that I want to share with you that really mean a lot to me. In First Selected Messages, page 333, I find this: Christ is the fragrance, the holy incense, which makes our petitions acceptable. See, it's because of Jesus that I have the right to come to His throne, and not only that, it's because of Him that my petitions, my prayers are acceptable to the Father. In CT, Counsels to Parent, Teachers, and Students at 241, we find this: Your mediator stands before the Father to present your prayers, mingled with His own merit and spotless righteousness, as fragrant incense. As I thought about that, it made me think of Ephesians 5:27. Turn there if you'd like with me, Ephesians 5:27. It says here that He might present it to Himself a glorious church. I like the sound of that, don't you? Not having spot, nor wrinkle, nor any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. And so I think of this statement here on 241, that He stands there, and by His merit and His spotlessness, it's by that He makes me spotless. Isn't that great? As I pray to Him, I'm receiving His spotlessness. Wow. And I just thought, wow, so that's how He presents His church spotless. As I come before His throne and I lift my prayers to heaven, it's by His spotlessness that I'm made spotless. Wow, what a blessing. And that's a sweet fragrance in the throne of God. We find that the Desire of Ages that Stuart presented to us that they're studying here, you're going to run across this quote. Look at this one here on page 667. Every sincere prayer. What's a sincere prayer? Yeah, it comes. In other words, you're thinking about it, and you're in your heart saying, "Oh Lord, I've just got this need. I got to lift it." That's a sincere prayer. In other words, one that you feel a desperate need to talk to God about, not just praying for the food really quick, or just a real quick prayer. Help me when I travel down the road. Not that those aren't important prayer. He's talking now about that prayer that comes from the deep desire of the heart. So this is where this is going. Every sincere prayer, He will present it to the Father without one awkward or stammering word. How does that feel right there? Do you feel sometimes like, I just don't know how to pray as I should? Do you feel inadequate to pray? Well, you can stop feeling that way right now, because He's saying, you know what, I got that covered. He says, without one awkward or stammering word, beautiful and fragrant with the incense of His own perfection. And so everything that you want to lift up to the Lord, no matter how you feel like you can't word it right, He says, I got it. I've got it, and I'm going to lift it perfectly before the Father. Isn't that great news? So this is the fragrance of of incense. Is Jesus, is that fragrance of incense. And so we want to now look at that incense a little closer. So open your Bibles with me to Exodus chapter 30. And we're going to look at verses 34 to 38. And the Lord said unto Moses, Take unto you sweet spices, the stacte, and onycha, the galbanum, these sweet spices with pure frankincense, of each shall there be a like weight. And thou shalt make it a perfume, a confection, after the art of the apothecary, tempered together, pure and holy. And thou shalt beat some of it very small, and put it before the testimony in the tabernacle of the congregation, where I will be with you. It shall be unto you most holy. And as for the perfume which you shall make, you shall not make to yourselves according to the composition thereof. It shall be unto you holy for the Lord. Whosoever shall make like unto it to smell thereto shall even be cut off from his people. That's pretty beautiful words until we get to the end and think, what in the world's going on there? Well, we will get to that. But let's take and unpack, if you will, together this ingredients of this incense. For this has really helped us understand the significance of incense. First, we look at the stacte, and it says that stacte produces a strong, bitter, and pepper perfume when burned by itself. That doesn't sound like it should be in there, does it? Peppered, strong, ooh, that doesn't sound good at all. Why is that in there? It's bitter. Well, the onycha, when burned, exudes a strong odor, which is not too pleasant. Huh? But it has a tendency to intensify and prolong the fragrance of the spices with which it is mixed, and convey the various odors in this incense through the atmosphere. Now you remember we talked about this going well over the camp and beyond the borders. Well, it's the onycha that made it travel like that. It gets into the atmosphere and just goes. That's the onycha's job, is to carry that fragrance beyond the borders. Galbanum, when dried and crushed and burned, produced a pungent odor. It added a stimulating and an exciting quality to the other perfumes with which it was mixed. And so this is the stimulating perfume, the incense that stimulates the others. And then we have the frankincense. Frankincense produces a strong and pleasant fragrance. Now we're talking, right? A strong and pleasant fragrance, which had the effect of pervading and covering all the unpleasant odors that we just described. And so it covers all that stuff and makes it beautiful. When I think of frankincense, the first thing that comes to my mind is, what do you think? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of frankincense? Myrrh. So you're thinking of the same thing as me. You're thinking of the birth of Jesus. You're thinking this is the gift that was given to Jesus. And I think, wow, that's the gift that we're given. It's that frankincense of Jesus. Because by him he makes all things what? Beautiful. It takes all the unpleasant experiences and he turns them for his glory. The frankincense, Jesus. Awesome. Now there's a fifth ingredient that we didn't read about, but we did read about, but you didn't catch it probably. Salt. Salt is then added to season and to preserve. So you think, well, where did you come up with the salt? Well, we'll just jump around here really quick and then we'll come back to it later. Verse 35. You notice what they say here in verse 35 after giving the list. It says, and thou shalt make it a perfume. In other words, you've got to put the things together. A confection after the art of the apothecary, tempered together, pure and holy. And so when you find out about the apothecary and what they do is they add salt to preserve it, to bring it together. Isn't that cool? And so even though salt is not mentioned, they mention the fact that it goes to the apothecary and they put it together, and the apothecary is going to add the salt. So we're going to look at the significance now of all 5 of those and why they're together. First of all, these 5 ingredients together, they represent the qualities of the prayers of Jesus, which, when coupled with our petitions, make them fragrant and acceptable. Because of these ingredients of the incense, our prayers are fragrant and acceptable. So let's break it down. Stacte. Stacte, then, what is that bitterness? Bitterness, then, helps us think about confession, doesn't it? It suggests confession. Well, what do you mean, Pastor, by bitterness of confession? Let's look at Psalm 66:18. Psalms 66 and verse 18. If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. That's kind of a bitter thought, and it makes you think, am I hiding iniquity? Am I opening up my heart to the Lord? It's a bitter thought to think that He's not going to hear me, that He's not going to hear my petition. What am I holding on to? What sin am I holding on to? Confession is not always easy, is it? That's why many times we prefer to pray this way: Lord, forgive my shortcomings. I don't want to think about my shortcomings, my sins. I want to just gloss them over. Or we just say, forgive me for my sins. Do we find ourselves praying that way? Forgive me for my sins? I'd like to encourage you not to word it that way. I would like you to dig up that bitterness of what it is and present that to the Lord. Unpack it, if you will. Because if you unpack it, that's the way He gets rid of it. If you keep it sealed in the box, well, you still got it. You need to unpack it. Even though it's bitter to do that, it doesn't feel good to do that. It will feel good when you're done unpacking it and you hand it to Him. Unpack that thing that's between you and God and say, here, I need to bring this out of the box and I need to give this to you. Will you do that? It may be a bitter experience, but it's an important part of the prayer. It's important to unpack the things that come between you and God, that He might hear you. Because He wants to hear you. He's desperate to hear from you. But if you hold on to sin, He cannot. The onika, it points to thanksgiving as the foundation of intercession. You say, well, wait a minute. You said it was kind of bitter, some of the odor from that. Well, let's take a look at James chapter 1. James chapter 1. Verse 2. Listen to how James puts it together. James 1 verse 2. He says, my brethren, count it all joy for what? When you fall into diverse temptation, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. And so we find here that our thanksgiving is not always comes from favorable conditions. Remember Jesus? For the joy set before Him, He endured what? The cross for you and me. Not that the cross was pleasant, but the joy that it represented was indeed a sweet fragrance. It was indeed a testimony of all testimonies. It was awesome because what it produced, our trials, when people see you and I going through a trial and coming through them with thankfulness, it's going to produce a fruit. What kind of fruit? Is they look and say, how did they do that? How are you so at peace when we're all afraid? And you get to share Jesus with them and say, well, this is how I have peace, because Jesus, I know, has got it handled. Right? And so you have a testimony of thankfulness, not of the great experience that wasn't so great, that was a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe a lot uncomfortable, but the testimony that it brings becomes the foundation of our prayer. It's a great ingredient. So we pray to God and say, oh, thank you, Lord, for bringing me through that. Isn't that great? And you pray that, say, thank you for bringing me through. What an awesome experience. I wish I didn't have it, but I'm glad I had it because I'm a better person now for it. Are you seeing that? The testimony. It's the foundation. Some testimonies are just beautiful, and you don't need the trial to have them. But some are not so good. And so we find that the onika, though sometimes it's not pleasant, with it, it makes the atmosphere of who we are represent Jesus, and it can be smelled outside the borders. People who don't know you will see something different about you that brings a pleasant drawing. Wow, I need to know what makes that person so wonderful. It makes you a nice person. Have you ever been around a grumpy person? Do you look forward to it? So like something like, I'm not a morning person. And so people they just okay, you stay your distance, right? Right? But when somebody is pleasant to be around, the opposite, people can't wait to be near that person who's full of thankfulness. You can't wait. Oh, always got a good word in due season. People love to be near that person. But if you're one of those, I'm not a morning person, no one wants to be near you. I'm going to give you a chance for the morning to wear on maybe a little bit. The onika has that a tendency then to bring an aroma of thankfulness, so people want to be near you. So you have a testimony to give. You see how beautiful that onika is? It's awesome. Well, what about the galbanum? When dried and crushed and burned, it produces a pungent odor, right? Well, here it is. Galbanum stimulating odor then alerts us to the need of eagerness to pray. How is it with you? Are you eager to pray? Or you just pray out of habit? Or like, oh, it's time for our evening prayer. Or, well, we better have morning prayer. Do you have an eagerness to pray? The galbanum is telling you to have an eagerness to draw near to God, an eagerness to be in His presence. It shouts to you and me that we should desire to be in His presence, because that's what gives us that thankfulness of the onika. And the bitterness removed because He's forgiven and washed us clean of all of our sins. Galbanum tells us, I want to come near to God. I want to be made like unto Him. What about then the frankincense? Pure frankincense covers all with pleasantness, shouting of Jesus' all-powerful name. In other words, I pray because Jesus has brought me here, and because of what He has done in my life and His promise of what He will do is a beautiful odor of frankincense that people see and smell, because they see what God has done and is doing in your life. What then about the salt? The salt then, the salt of faith preserves and flavors all of our prayers. So let's take a look at a text to see how that works. Matthew 5:13. This is what Jesus was thinking about, because He knew that they knew that to put those incense together, that they had to mix salt to preserve it, to make it come together, to season and preserve. He says this about you and me. He says, you and me, He calls us this, are the salt of the earth. We're that salt. Because of the blessing that's in your life, it brings together and preserves the glory of God and shows His promises to be true. He says, you're that salt. You're what bring everything together. They see my glory through you. But look what He says here. But if salt has lost its savor, when that person quits coming before the throne of God with eagerness to pray, to lift up their petitions before God, what happens to your savor? Lost. I'm a Christian. That's what it's like to be a Christian. I don't want no part of it. That salt has lost its savor. It's lost it. Wherewith shall it be salted then? It is therefore good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under the foot of men. You see what happens here is when we don't allow, Jesus is that salt. And if we're not salted with Him, and we come to Him in prayer to bring the beauty of prayer and the transformation that it brings, He says, you're good for nothing. Wow. I've been told that a few times when I was growing up. You're good for nothing. Well, or you will never amount to a hill of beans. Have you ever been told that? Well, I don't know what that means to be a hill of beans, but I'm kind of thinking, well, I'm not a hill of beans. But, I don't know what that really means. Anyway, the salt, it preserves and flavors all of it. So now we want to break down the rest of Exodus. So come back with me now to Exodus chapter 30. We find here in verse 36, it says, thou shalt beat some of it very small, and put on it before the testimony of the tabernacle of the congregation. So when we think of this incense and its significance, we find it was beaten very small. Why beat it very small? What does that tell us? We need to look to Isaiah 53. Turn there with me, Isaiah 53. Verses 4 through 6. Surely He hath borne our griefs. He has carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem Him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon Him, and with His stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord hath laid on Him the iniquity of us all. And so when we realize that incense was crushed and beaten, it shows that by the incense, the sweetness of the fragrance of that incense are there available because He was willing to be beaten and striped in my place. That I'm the one that deserved that crushing. I'm the one that deserved that bruising. But because He did that for me, my prayers are a sweet incense. That's a wonderful testimony there He has given us in Isaiah. And that's the significance of that incense. Now let's go back and look at Exodus 36 and 37. And thou shalt offer every day a bullock for a sin. Whoops, I'm in the wrong place. Wrong 37, sorry. And as for the perfume which thou shalt make, you shall not make to yourselves, according to the composition thereof. It shall be unto you holy for the Lord. Whoever shall make like unto that, to smell thereto, shall even be cut off from his people. What's he trying to tell us here of being cut off from his people? Why is this so important to put this here? With this wonderful, beautiful confection of incense, he adds this warning. What's wrong? What's he trying to teach me? To learn that, let's turn to Mark chapter 11. In Mark chapter 11, we're going to be focusing primarily on verses 23 through 26, but we want to make it come alive. We've got to look at the things before that so that we can understand the emphasis of those verses. So let's start here in verse 12. In verse 12, actually verse 13, and Jesus, it says, seeing a fig tree afar off having leaves, he came, if happily he might find any thereon. There were some figs. But he came to it, he found nothing but leaves. Nothing but leaves. He was disappointed, wasn't he? He was hoping to find some nourishment, something good on that fig tree. We're not going to discuss the last part, for the time of the fig was not yet. That's for another sermon. But we're looking at the figs here. He says he was not happy with these, when they didn't have figs. And what did Jesus do? On verse 14, he talked to this fig tree and said, no man will eat a fruit of you forever. He just cursed this fig tree. Now, in between the disciples seeing the answer to this curse, something else happens. Jesus throws the money changers out of the temple. In between, he throws them out. He cleanses the temple. Why is he cleansing the temple? Isn't the sanctuary, the temple, the place where he wants to meet with us there? So there must be something wrong with their form or what they were doing in that sanctuary, right? So you have made it a den of thieves. You have corrupted my place. How have they corrupted it? Not just by the money changing, but by what they were thinking and what they were doing and what they thought of themselves. As a Pharisee, they thought of themselves as spotless. As a Jew, they thought they earned salvation because they were Abraham's seed. But as I thought about that fig leaves, it took me back to the garden. Adam and Eve, when they sinned, what is it that they did? They sewed fig leaves together so they weren't naked. But did it work? No, because we read in the story that when Jesus showed up to walk through the garden, they said, what did you hide? Well, because we're naked. Well, no. You had fig leaves, remember? You see, your righteousness is what the fig leaves represent. Self-righteousness. Like I'm in heaven because of my merit, because I'm good. No. That's what fig leaves represent. That doesn't produce good fruit. You need the fruit of his righteousness. And so God had to make them new coats. Coats of skin representing death had to happen. Whose death? Jesus' death on their behalf, so that I can produce righteousness in you. You can't do it on your own. And so we find in this story Jesus setting the table for what was about to take place. And so we find here, starting in verse 20, he says, and in the morning, as they passed by, they saw that fig tree. It was dried up from the roots. They go, whoa, look at that thing. It's just dried up, withered up. And Peter, looking at it, it's always Peter, calling to remembrance, said unto him, Master, oh, look, that fig tree which you cursed, it's withered away. He was pretty amazed, wasn't he? Like, wow. Well, we would all be amazed. Like, how in the world? That thing was so green and beautiful. No figs, but green and beautiful. So what good is green and beautiful without figs or without fruit? No good at all. And so he got it. So now he answers why this is dried up. And so let's look now at what happens here in verse 23. He says, for verily I say unto you that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, be thou removed, and be cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. Have you looked at that prayer or that statement with astonishment? Does that mean we need to go around casting mountains into the sea to prove our faith? If so, we're in trouble here in Kansas, we don't have any sea. We sure don't have any mountains. And so we have to go and find a molehill and say, be into the lake. Is that what he's asking us to do? You see, the context teaches us otherwise. This is simply a comparison of also the fig tree or self-righteousness. He says, if you believe, what will happen will come true. So what are the mountains? The mountains are that which would crush you, that which would stop you from having the blessing from God. Do you believe that he can bless you? You see, the children of Israel, when they were leaving Egypt, are you and I leaving Egypt, by the way? I hope we're on that journey to the promised land, right? We're leaving Egypt, and as we're leaving Egypt, we have Pharaoh's army behind us. And we find ourselves grumbling and complaining. You brought us out here to die. Because the Red Sea's before them, they can't get across this. And so, what does God do? He removes the mountain, parts the sea, and they go through, and he buries the enemy. You see what happened to the mountain? The mountain of the Egyptian army was buried in the sea. Cast into the sea. That which pursues you, which is trying to destroy you, God says, do you believe that I can bury that in the sea? Do you believe that? That's what he's talking about. He's talking about, do you believe that I can do what I say? Or are you too busy grumbling and complaining? Or are you too busy trying to fix it yourself? Neither way brings forth good fruit. And like the fig tree, you may have some wonderful leaves, but you have no fruit. And so verse 24, he says, therefore I say unto you, whatsoever things you desire when you pray, believe that you receive them, and ye shall have them. Oh Lord, put me a ZR1 Corvette in my driveway. It's not there. What? I prayed, I believed, and I don't have my Corvette. Is that what he's asking for us to pray here? Now, does that mean we shouldn't ask God for stuff? No, it doesn't mean that, but it means that's not what he's emphasizing. He's trying to emphasize that relationship. He's trying to emphasize when you ask God to remove the mountain of evil coming against you and believe it, I've got it handled. I've got it as good as buried. It's not about the new pickup truck in your driveway or Corvette or new motorcycle for Stuart over there, or you already got a nice new one. But, you know, he's not talking about those things. He's not talking about the luxuries of life. He's talking about that which would destroy you, right? He says, so don't use my prayer wrong. Don't look at this verse and say, well, I prayed for things and God just doesn't deliver like he says. See, he says stuff here, but we use it wrong. You remember the incense? Whoever tries to use my incense wrong, it's a curse. When we use God's prayers wrong, it's a curse. He cannot answer those prayers. That's what he's talking about in Exodus. He says, you make this sweet fragrant for yourself. You're praying for who? For me, 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 me. Instead of praying for you. Say, oh Lord, you know how our people are struggling. You've heard their requests for prayers today. Oh Lord, I bring those petitions before you again. Is this your prayer? Or is it me, me, me? That's the confection used, and God says, I cannot answer that prayer. I cannot answer it. You know, in Revelations 3:16, well, I didn't finish verse 26. We need to do that one first. Sorry. But if you do not forgive, so he finishes verse 25, he says, and when you stand praying, he says, forgive. If you have anything against anyone, that your Father also, which is in heaven, may forgive your trespasses. Did I read that wrong? I did. And when you stand praying, forgive. In other words, you got to forgive people. And if you have aught against any, then your Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. So how is it with you and your enemies? Have you hanging on to that? Are you holding bitterness against people? Are you angry with somebody? Or have you forgiven them? Have you gone to them and said, look, you know, I'm sorry. sorry for what I've done to offend you that made you angry with me and treat me the way that you did. Maybe you don't even know why. You should go to them and apologize. Let them know it's important to you how they treat you. And if they don't accept it, then you can't help that. But you need to do this, because if you think you're a prayer warrior, if you think that you can just go to God and pray, and yet you have things against people, guess what? He says, I can't hear you either. That doesn't mean he can't hear you. That means he can't move. Okay? He's not going to move. Of course he hears you. But he says, I can't do anything about that because you're not listening to my advice. I can't answer your prayer when you hold aught against your brother, when you're not representing me. You're walking around with fig leaves on and there's no fruit on you. Are you following that? You're not bearing fruit, so I can't help you out. Let's take a look at that in reference to Revelations 3:16. This, of course, is the chapter here, the latter part. It was about the Laodicean church, which we as Adventists know that this is pointing to the last church in the last days. We know it's pointing to the Adventist church, and look what it says here about us. So then, because you are lukewarm, kind of like my shower today, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. What's the problem with lukewarm? It didn't feel very good in my shower today. I'll tell you that. I danced and got out of there quick. I don't know what happened to my hot water, so I got to investigate that. But wasn't very good. Lukewarm means that you proclaim something and you're not. And God says, I'm not happy with that. I would rather you be cold or hot, he says. He says, I would rather be totally against me and people know that, rather than you say that you're one of mine and you misrepresent me. I want you to be totally hot for me or cold against me, not this in-between thing. Because when you're that in-between thing, I want to spew you out of my mouth. I don't care for that. Just like Jesus looked at that fig tree, I don't care for you because you have no fruit. Wither up. He says, I don't like you to make fragrant incense to replicate what I've done as a blessing and use it for yourself. That's lukewarm. It misrepresents God. This is what he says, these things. He's talking about, don't misrepresent me. It's a challenge for you and I not to misrepresent God. And that brings us to James 5:16. Confess your faults. I know that's hard, isn't it? Confess your faults one to another. If you're like me, you're kind of a private person. I like to keep my dirty laundry, in my own basket in my own laundry room. Okay? Well, that's not what it says here. It tells you got to confess your faults. It says one to another. Why should I confess my faults to you? What business is it of yours? Huh? Yeah. If I confess a fault to somebody and then they will say, let me pray with you, when I get victory over that, guess who gets to praise with me? My friend that I confessed my fault with. We see God at work. And what does that do then about them and their relationship? It encourages them to say, well, I have something that we need to pray about too. And that gives them courage to do that which they would not, because they saw the fruit. Here's the fruit thing again, of what God will do when we follow his what? Advice. This is what you do. Because I want you all to grow in grace. I want you to all to be found in me. And so he says, confess your faults one to another. Pray for one another that you may be healed. Are you feeling like God is not fixing you up like you want? that you're not getting the healing that you're hoping for? Maybe you need to back up to those verses ahead. Because he says, when you pray for others, when you pray and confess your faults with one another, when you do those things, now I can heal you. Isn't that neat? He says, I want to heal you, but you won't do what I've asked. You're thinking about yourself. When you stop thinking about you and start thinking about others, he can take care of you. He can now take care of you. We had a children's story today. That little boy surrendered his basket of food, didn't he? He gave it up. That means he was like, well, I guess there goes that food. Because that's not going to go very far. It's never going to get back to me. But now he got more food than he could imagine, enough to, as Noreen pointed out, I hadn't thought about that part, to take a basket home to mom and dad. I sent you there with a little lunch, and you came back with a meal for us. Isn't that cool? I like that thought. So he was able to have a whole basket to give because he gave everything. He found his healing. He found healing because he gave and thought. Jesus asked for that. Jesus asked for you and I to confess our faults that we may be healed. You want to be healed? Well, you got to give up your basket. Got to give up your basket. Thank you for that story, Noreen. That was great. He goes right along with this analogy here. He says, then it tells you this right here. Do you want to be a prayer warrior? It starts with those first paragraph, and then it brings you to here. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. How are you a righteous man? When you confess your faults one to another, pray for one another, you receive your healing, you have power to pray. It didn't start with power to pray. It starts with believing and going that route. And now you know when I pray for them, you can have belief that God's going to attend to that because your heart is right and your prayer is now lined up with His will. You're not praying for your desire. Because until our heart's lined up right, we're praying for what we want. And what we want's not lined up with His will. Are you getting the picture here? So if you make my incense and just use it the way you want, that's a curse. Do you see how that all fits together? Why He put that in there? Because He wants to bless us. He says, I want my incense to be a rich blessing for people. I want to touch lives and to make a difference. Jesus is saying, do you see the significance of my incense? If you do, use it for my glory, and you will be healed.